she has to communicate that this makes her feel unseen, that if he doesn't know her here, he doesn't really know her. This is not a casual need. This is not, I want ice cream. This is who I am.
Our question today comes from Fiona, who states that she and her husband have been married for 10 years, and she feels that they're in a good place overall. One thing that they struggle with is her need to express her sexuality in a kinky context. Her partner is willing to engage in BDSM and kinky play for her sake, but it is infrequent. Fiona says that without kinky play, she feels lonely and she feels that she lacks intimacy in the relationship. It feels like her partner doesn't fully accept her needs. She seeks advice on how to communicate the importance of her kink needs without sounding entitled, needy, or unreasonably demanding.
The best analogy is couples that have wildly different libidos. There's an entire Reddit forum called HL Community, which stands for High Libido Community, about people whose partners have a much lower libido than they do and trying to navigate that gap. Kink works exactly the same way by analogy. So if you have a high libido and your partner doesn't want to have sex or goes through the motions of having sex with you, they're just laying there, a chore that they have to get through, a duty that they're providing you, it just doesn't work. It's just not what you're after. It's not going to provide you with the thing you need. And there are ways of trying to navigate those things, and all of them are phenomenally imperfect with a very low success rate. The difficult thing here is there may be ways to navigate that, and we can talk about those, but to be very realistic, the success rate here is not going to be great, because if he does not feel it in his bones, you can try and get him to feel it in his bones, and there are ways, like I said, we'll talk about that in a second, but it doesn't happen super often. He's had a bunch of opportunities to some degree of finding that feeling in himself, and if he hasn't done it, then it's a high possibility that it's just not there. And just like a person with a low libido who just doesn't care about sex that much, maybe they're just missing something about sex, and maybe they can find a way to truly deeply enjoy it and crave it and need it and be totally into it 3 times a day like their partner. But a person who doesn't really think about sex more often than twice a year, getting to the point where they're craving it 3 times a day and they can't go without it, unless there's a hormone issue or unless there's some sort of medical thing that can be changed, it's just going to be unlikely because it's just not who they are. So, talking about ways to communicate around this, what are the best low probability but non-zero probability options that she has here? Is a 10-year marriage. It's difficult to just shrug it off without giving it a shot. I do think it's important to communicate the importance of this to her partner, that this is not a casual need. This is not, I want vanilla ice cream. This is who I am. Our relationship may not survive, or if it survives, it will do so in a very limping sort of way eventually. And she needs to be honest with herself about that, and she needs to be honest with him about that. This has to be solved, or the relationship will either take a dramatic turn for the less involved and they're going to be roommates, or there's going to be significant distress ongoing for the rest of their lives, or the relationship's going to end. Those are the 3 possibilities of not solving this. The other language I like to use that I bring up in the book that I think is helpful is, imagine a circle of all the things you might consent to if somebody brought it up. Then within that, there's a smaller circle of the things that you would have responsive enthusiasm for. Is, oh, I didn't think of that restaurant, but I actually love it when we go. Yeah, I never remember that. Great, let's totally go there. So it's a little more than just consent. You're actually pretty enthusiastic about it when you're reminded of it. And then there are things that we have spontaneous desire for. If I haven't been to my favorite restaurant in Austin in a month, I start craving it. If I haven't had a steak in a certain period of time, I'm going to be craving that. And so if she is having spontaneous desire for this and he is at most consenting to it, there's a gap there in their levels of interest. I think that she has to communicate that this makes her feel unseen, that if he doesn't know her here, he doesn't really know her. And she's asking something big. I think she has to own that she's asking something big and still ask it anyway. It's not entitled or needy, but it is demanding. Maybe not unreasonably demanding. It's a demand of necessity, but it is a pretty big demand. And she doesn't mean to be, but ends up being an ultimatum whether you like it or not. And it's not intended to be unfair. It's not intended to be manipulative. It's just the way it is. There's a certain aspect to which that is both unfair and necessary. And I think owning that will help.
I have a slightly different answer for
Sure.
the writer. And I think it's good we have different experiences with Kink that allows us to approach these questions with different perspectives. One of the differences between us that is being highlighted in the way you've answered the question is that you have always known that you're kinky. I mean, from a very young age. I had got into it relatively later in life, even though I would have sex with women and there would be some slapping going on and all of the rest of it. I remember distinctly once, over a decade ago, I was telling about this girl who wanted me to do all these things to her. And I'm like, this woman's crazy, right? And you were like, no, this is kink and this is how that works and blah, 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 blah. Sure. And now, of course, I consider myself a convert or having understood what it is that lies behind the actions. So another way of approaching this is to get her husband to understand exactly why it is that this is so important to her. You started off with, this is important to me, this is what I need, you're going to have to come around to it, and if you can't feel it in your bones, it's not going to work out. And that could be very, off-putting is not the right word, but it could just go over his head because he doesn't really understand what is it that underlies this need. He hears her fully, clearly, yes, I know you need it. But if it's, and this is perhaps one of the reasons we've started this podcast, is to have much more intelligent conversations about the psychology behind this. Because you go to all these other kink podcasts and it's about you should tie her up this way and maybe you should spank her that way. And it's all these superficialities that don't get to the heart of the psychology behind it. And I'm coming at this as a person who was attracted to or intrigued by kink for a long time, but didn't really get it. And then when I did get it, I'm like, oh crap, this is actually what it is. So she has great language for this in the question. She seems to almost be there herself, but she doesn't seem to be able to herself articulate why it is it's so important. But the key words that she uses that she feels lonely and she feels like she lacks intimacy when they go without kink for a long time. Now, what she should further ask herself is, why does she feel that way? What is it about? And you have in your book and in multiple episodes in the podcast talked about how this is all about exercising the Jungian archetypes, and that we all have a shadow, and that when we're engaged in kink play, we're engaged in the process of integrating our shadow, and that we should not turn away from the shadow. And then when we embrace it and integrate ourselves better, we become more whole. And kink is is an embodied analogy of that process. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people to whom this is all gobbledygook and it makes no sense. But we're trying to get these ideas out so that when people are talking about kink, they have some kind of a philosophical language to understand why it is these things are as impactful or as meaningful to so many people as they are. Because right now, the attitude towards kink is this sort of people giggling and saying, oh, this is all these naughty people being naughty. It isn't taken seriously, I suppose, is another way of putting it. And in order to take it seriously, you have to understand it seriously. You have to understand that this is a deep part of who you are. This is why she says she feels lonely. She doesn't feel like she's seen. She lacks intimacy.
Maybe we just have a difference in the order in which we would communicate it. So all the things I was saying is for her to frame to her partner that this is serious. Then she can communicate, and we'll get to that right now, is the underlying philosophy. How can we navigate this? What should we do? But I think it's important to really triple down on this is important. So all of that prefacing was just me trying to say, hey, when she sits down to have this conversation with her partner, she needs to say, things are on the line here, so pay attention.
Right. Of course.
Get your shit together.
I think that would naturally flow out of if she was able to deeply understand that this is a shadow integration. This is not me just wanting to spice up the bedroom, right? Which is how kink is often interpreted in these cosmopolitan articles. We're not just spicing up. I'm not just like a really horny person and I want more horniness, because that could just be seen as dismissive. The husband would say, you are willing to put our entire marriage on the line because you just want to spice it up. So he could be very dismissive about that. She could say that it's important, want. And he would then say, well, you are being unreasonable about this. In
Right.
much the same way that she could say, hey, I want a better car or a bigger house, or I want you to do the dishes more or whatever. And if you
Yep.
don't, then our marriage is on the line. It will have the same sense of disconnect for him if he doesn't really understand that this runs really deep. She could say ad nauseum that this is important, but unless it lands for him that this is a deep psychological need, and that there's good philosophy behind why this is so impactful, he may not take it as seriously. If the only threat is, I'm going to leave if you don't take it seriously, he may actually be offended by that. He might it seems your horniness, your libido is more important than our marriage, kids, and life together. That could start the conversation on a difficult footing.
I don't disagree with you. Maybe we can talk this out a little bit, because you're right. Starting it off in an antagonistic way with a threat to leave may not be the best option, but framing the absolute deadly seriousness of this for herself and for her partner, I think, is important as a beginning place. And then to say, look, a challenge here is that I am craving, it's like I am craving a steak, and in a weird way, you've never had a steak. And the problem is you've eaten, I'm making this weird analogy now, but you've eaten an impossible meat steak. So you think you've had a steak, but you haven't had a steak. And I'm trying to tell you that you haven't had a steak, and it's somewhat important. And so she has to both communicate its critical importance and communicate her empathy that he probably is not going to see why it's important, because it feels to him, from his perspective, it's just this cosmos spicing up the bedroom. Like, what's the big deal? Why is this so important? And so she has to be empathetic that that's going to be his initial point of view, and say, look, I understand you feel like steak's not that special, first of all. You feel like you've had a steak. You feel like you weren't impressed by it. And yeah, maybe you won't crave steak, even if you have it. But I'm trying to tell you that would be a problem. And so I'm trying to give us an opportunity for you to at least taste a steak and figure out what that feels like before we have this decision. And then comes all this communication about what it means. What does kink mean? And the way I frame this most clearly in my mind is, what if you could tell that your partner didn't mean it when they said, I love you? How would that feel? Would you want to stay married if that were not going to change? And they were going to continue saying I love you when you told them to, or they'll say I love you too if you say it first, but they never say it first, they never bring it up, and you can tell that they're pretty much just humoring you. That is basically what's happening here. And that's an important thing. Again, people with mismatched libidos have exactly that same experience is, well, my partner never initiates sex. She never wants to have sex. I have to talk her into it, and then she's pretty just going along with it. If and when she does, it's half-hearted and it's lackluster. Yeah, you know what? That's a problem, right? And so this has a similar flavor. And so using those analogies can be very helpful to communicate to the partner, oh yeah, I wouldn't be okay with that. If you were just half-hearted when you said you love me, and I was looking at the rest of my life being with someone who never said I love you first, and when they said it back, very clearly was communicating that it was just obligation, not really truly felt. I think most people would get that that would be an untenable long-term situation. And then to say that just like having sex with someone you are deeply in love with is different than having sex with someone you're not in love with, having truly kinky sex is qualitatively different than non-kinky sex. It's the same shift because it is a meaningful shift. It is intimacy. It is who I am. And without it, it's as if part of me is not being seen, not being addressed, not being loved, because it's in the shadow and you're not engaging with it. Now, in my opinion, in terms of how to address this, the thing that gives it the best chance of addressing it is for her to put her needs after, and this, the other reason it's so important to express all of these things, in my opinion, is because the next step is for her to put all of that aside and give him space to find his kinky self. So for him to say, okay, I'm going to try and find my kinky self and see what I can enjoy in this space, But I can't do that under the pressure of you having a set of predefined scripts and things that you need. Oh, you want to be spanked 10 times and then you want to be tied up and then you want to be... Well, I can't find what I want because I'm just following your script. And my kinky self is not sufficiently clearly defined to withstand that pressure. So, yes, we're going to be kinky, but for the first little bit here, we're going to have to be kinky on my terms and say, okay, I'm going to read... now, he has to commit to reading erotica, to talking about fantasies, to talking about what he wants... But she has to commit to going along with his fantasies in this arena pretty strongly for a while so that he can figure himself out. Otherwise, he'll never find his true, intimate, kinky self, and it'll always be half-hearted because he's playing her script.
You can't find your kinky self with a gun to your head, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
huh?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.